Secular science fiction often explores darker themes such as gene editing and consciousness uploading. Christian made sci fi, however, tends to lean on the softer side, emphasizing worlds without Earth or its cultures. How might this leave an opening for more complex futuristic tales that dare to engage with controversial themes? Novelist Kerry Nietz, no stranger to bold sci fi, joins us to discuss how edgier science fiction can challenge Christian readers. Welcome aboard the Starship Fantastical Truth. I am one of your two captains, E. Stephen Burnett, the publisher of Lorehaven.com. On Fantastical Truth, we find the best of Christian-made fantasy, science fiction, and beyond, and we apply the grandeur, the awesomeness of these stories to the real world, into which we are called on mission.
And I'm Zackary Russell. You can call me Zach. I have been a sci-fi fan my whole life. And you'll probably notice right away I sound a little sick today. This is the first time in over a year I've been sick. And thankfully it's not the Rona, just a usual kind of thing. But this is episode 61. How does edgier science fiction challenge Christian readers? And we have a special guest today, Kerry Nietz. He is an award-winning science fiction author, has over half a dozen speculative novels in print, and his novel A Star Curiously Singing won the Reader's Favorite Gold Medal Award for Christian science fiction. It's notable for its dystopian and cyberpunk vibe. And Kerry is most famous for a book that started out as kind of a joke or a dare. It's called Amish Vampires in Space. It was mentioned on The Tonight Show, and it's got a really bright future along with two other books that followed up. So we're going to have a really fun discussion today. Welcome, Kerry.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks, guys.
Kerry, we just had you to discuss another fandom, but now we get to delve a little bit more deeply into your repertoire of futuristic tales. So we'll be talking a lot about futuristic aspects in this episode. And Zach and listeners, the reason why we felt it was a great time to tackle this is because in just our last episode, episode 60, Zach and I were exploring the topic of why our real-life researchers don't seem to care for the warnings of science fiction that man was not meant to play God, that man was not meant to meddle. You're not supposed to go splicing together the embryonic parts of humans and monkeys or any of that sort of nonsense. And Zach and I discovered, in part of our research for that episode, that really most of the examples that we could think of those kinds of warnings are from secular science fiction, whether it's Star Trek or Doctor Who or all kinds of other fiction novels, books, movies, TV shows. It seems that all of the engagement with those edgier themes came from those stories. And it may not be our fault that we just don't know about any authors out there who are more specifically dealing with these kinds of themes in Christian-made science fiction. But of course, the one that we just can't help but think of is Kerry Nietz. He tends to be writing about those kinds of things. Not so much warning about mad science, but his stories do tend to go in some edgier directions. And we'll explain what we mean by edgier in just a moment. First, let's stop by the concession stand for a few just recently baked funnel cakes, maybe a little popcorn and maybe some extra cheesy nachos. First concession of this topic opens up a few other topics like the definitions of science fiction, space opera versus harder sci-fi, whether or not you have aliens, whether or not you have Earth somewhere in the past, that sort of thing. It even opens up a related topic of what male or female readers tend to prefer in their fantasy or science fiction. So obviously we will need to just touch on those topics, won't be able to go into those too in depth this time. Snack number 2 from the stand. Yes, we emphasize a certain type of science fiction, what we would call a science fiction with edgier themes. But just to clarify, and hopefully long-term listeners of this podcast and subscribers at Lorehaven know about this, we do enjoy all types of fantastical stories, whether they're soft or cozy fantasy, more complex fantasy, space opera, science fiction, dystopian, steampunk, all of those, whether it's edgy or not. If the story is well made, it glorifies Jesus, especially if it's made by a Christian. We want to endorse all those kinds of stories across what we do. Thirdly, by the word edgier, we don't mean edgy content like darkness, no parents, sex, violence, cussed words, angst, trauma, killer robots necessarily, all that sort of thing. We're talking more about edgier ideas, ideas that you would more likely hear about on a podcast or in a news story about groundbreaking science, like scientists splice together human and monkey DNA, that kind of thing. Something that makes you a bit uncomfortable, that makes you realize that science has some dangers. That's the kind of thing that we're talking about, and we'll go into that a little bit more as we discuss with Kerry.
So, Kerry, what are some of the edgier themes that you dive into in your stories?
Amish vampires in space, for instance. I thought it was a really interesting idea to see how a very non-violent, passive society interacted with when they're confronted with a society like of vampires, for instance, that aren't that way at all. Obviously, are very violent and self-driven. And I think the big theme for me too is, okay, how, at what point do they ever fight against this threat? That's kind of worked out through the main characters and their different respective viewpoints and worldviews. So that would be, I guess, more of an edgier theme, especially since the Amish genre usually doesn't go that way at all. It's usually very much more romance centric. With the Dark Trench trilogy, I thought it'd be interesting to see what it would look like. There are some countries in the world that would like a worldwide Sharia law, worldwide Islamic domination. So works out to like 500 years in the future, the setting for it. And I just wanted to see kind of what did that look like, but also intersect it with the growth in technology and the idea that by then there might be implants in people's heads, and that not only gave them access to the internet and sort of the futurized technologies like robots and whatnot, but also controlled their behavior in some ways. And I think that's something we see worked out more and more these days, even on the internet. We know that AIs are kind of controlling what we see and trying to feed toward our emotions in one way or the other. So this is kind of that extrapolated, into a future 500 years from now, where it's a little different than what we see today, but also with a lot of similarities. So kind of exploring, those ideas. I'm driven by what if this happened, and kind of go from there.
Yeah, that is exactly how I was introduced to Kerry Nietz's fiction. Is not with Amish vampires in space, but with the book one of the Dark Trench saga, which is called A Star Curiously Singing. And one of the aspects of that book that is so unique is it puts it right up front. This is a world that is ruled by the caliphate. This is a world ruled by a certain view of Sharia law, and which, I don't believe, Kerry, that you ever say in the book, the word Islam, but it is pretty, no. I mean, it's obviously not a derivative. It's not a fantasy equivalent. That the book asks what if about a certain view of Islam and extrapolates that half a millennium in the future. This by itself, to me, set the book apart, because a lot of science fiction made by Christians tends to be a little bit more generalized. And a lot of this is other books and other authors whom we love. But I would say that in general, I see that there's kind of a vision of the future in which Christianity is portrayed as a lighter approach. This isn't the type of future where you would have Baptist, Methodists, Presbyterians, Buddhists in other religions, or Islam for that matter. It's all kind of homogenized. And there are advantages to that, especially if you go in more of the softer sci-fi or space opera side of things. But there's also great possibility in stories such as yours that ask about specific groups, such as the Amish. That those are our Amish, in the future, hundreds of years, with more or less the same beliefs and a kind of a Christian-derived pacifism philosophy as our Amish neighbors today. And the cover and title of Amish Vampires in Space and its two sequels, like, readers need to understand, those are the only funny parts, really. With the, you've got a few little lampshaded moments in the stories themselves, but otherwise these are very serious explorations, just like you said. And I find just wonderful opportunities there for us to engage in these kinds of real world ideas, this kind of edgier themes that other stories are just not able to do because they have a different creative direction.
So, Kerry, here's my question. You mentioned in the Dark Trench saga how there's these implants that give people access to the internet, but it also sort of gives the internet access to them, right? It kind of works both ways. And you said it modifies their behavior, their thoughts. And so what kind of was the inspiration of that? And tell me more about that in your story world.
Yeah, I'd love to. So that series kind of evolved from just a couple of different ideas that came together in my head. I had this sort of image once of this idea once of this coder of the future who was kind of part psychologist and was sitting in a room discussing with a robot, trying to determine what is wrong with this robot. Why is it functioning the way it is? And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like a different way of, he might be able to take it apart, but he can't get to all the answers that way. He has to talk with it. And I thought that was interesting. And then there's a show I saw once where they showed one of the Islamic countries where the king or prince or whatever, they were taking a tour of his one of his houses, and in one room there were three guys that were recording things that he might want to see off of every network you can imagine. So their whole day was spent recording video and cataloging it. And I thought, oh, that's really fascinating. These are my heroes of the future. They're guys who have to do that kind of technical work all the time. And I thought, okay, well, so they're connected. They have like an implant, because that just to me seemed like this kind of cool way for them to be instantly connected and have their thought waves go straight to what they're working on. But obviously that would almost make them a superhero, right? They now have control of everything, and like, okay, well, there has to be some kind of governing force to that. And then I thought, oh, okay, this implant can actually shock them. It can shock their brain, so to speak. And it has its own set of rules built in based on the theology, based on the worldview, and that will keep them kind of in check, keep them slaves, like a horse with a bit in their mouth. A very powerful animal, but they have a bit that can turn them. And I thought, okay, this is pretty cool. And what would the struggles be between them and this technological bit in their brain? So that's kind of where that came from.
Well, I like that, Kerry. I know from, I didn't get to this part in your bio, but I know you have a computer science background. You were in the software industry. You're obviously a fan of technology.
Yeah.
And I know you're not Amish. I mean, you're not Amish, right? So
no,
no. You don't approach this from like a Luddite perspective where you're just hate technology or afraid. Like you're interested, but you seem to have not only a fascination, but almost a caution with it of here's how things could go wrong in our quest to make them go right. Does that sound about right?
Yes. And just how much of an iterative process it is, and a creative process. And the main characters in Dark Trends are called debuggers, which in coding lingo, debugger is an actual tool you use to look inside a machine and figure out what's wrong. So they've kind of taken on that nickname. They're obviously humans, but they're debuggers. They figure out what, find the bugs and try to fix them in whatever it is they're working on. So, I thought that was kind of cool. And you're right, I do have a kind of a strong technological background, but I also grew up on a farm, which is kind of a weird dichotomy. So I do have a bit of an attachment to that whole rural setting. And I live in Ohio, where actually the largest population of Amish in America live. Most people don't know that, but it's true. So they're within a few hour drive of where I live. And so if I wanted to immerse myself in that, I could. So it's interesting, I know, a little weird, but I guess all of us geeks kind of are in some ways. So,
well, and from our conversation offline earlier, you were talking about how there's a cell phone tower or something on a grain elevator in your area.
Yes.
So just what a great mesh of kind of old country and 21st century, right?
Yeah, I get my internet via WISP, which is a wireless internet service provider, and it comes from a local town, maybe 8-9 miles away, and they bounce it off a grain elevator that's closer to me, about a road over, and that's how I get my internet. So pretty cool.
Yeah, which also may explain some of the difference in audio that you, podcast listener, may be hearing now. Kerry, I think we've talked about this before, but when I first saw the description for A Star Curiously Singing, unfortunately, I think, fell into a trap that maybe some readers would when they read the description, and especially in the late 2000s when it came out, and they go, oh, this is going to be, this is going to be one of the, some kind of a hyper patriotic, no more terrorism type book. This is about Christianity versus Islam. It's going to be a polemic. That could not be
Yeah.
further from the truth when you actually read the book and you are going into the world and the very head of Sandfly as he's discovering this world into which the creator A Cubed is breaking back in. And we got robot repairs, we got a space elevator, we got all kinds of awesomeness, but it is technology
Yeah.
explored for the sake of humanity. You've got those ideas mixed up in there, the worldview differences handled very sensitively, as well as the technology. You mentioned that Sandfly has these stops in his head that will
Right.
head off certain thoughts. If he's starting to think in a particular direction that the imams believe is sinful, then he will receive a penalty for that. And then finding freedom and then responsibility once something changes with his relationship with technology. That is a key theme of the Dark Trench saga going forward. So that's actually one thing that we run into when we're talking about sci-fi with these kinds of overt themes by Christian authors, is it trips a stop in our own heads that we have kind of put there on our own. So we've kind of programmed in where we think, oh, this must be preachy. If you're dealing with science fiction with a future of specific groups named like the Amish, well, this must be preachy. Overt equals preachy. And I'll just go out on a limb and say I disagree with that. I think that you don't need to hide all these different groups or labels or words out of fear of being preachy. There are so many opportunities in acknowledging these groups and these worldview differences, and especially asking what if about these cultural developments in the future. We have so many opportunities to explore these and see how these open up challenges and ask further questions. You don't have to get to the end of the book and answer all those questions. A good story is
Right.
going to leave plenty of those open and be part of the conversation, not trying to be a conversation ender.
Right. I think that's what science fiction is, right? It should be a playground of ideas. Like it should be okay, extrapolate how this idea, extrapolate it, multiply it. How would it end up? How could it work out? And with Amish vampires, that started from, okay, how would the Amish get into space and become vampires? It started with the title as the seed, and a little thinking about it, and it's like, I think I could figure out a way that would happen. And I got like 30,000 words into it, and told my publisher at the time about it, and he said, well, if you can make that work, I'll publish it. So that was kind of the start, but it all came from mental exercise. How could I make this happen, and what would happen if?
So this is an exact blend of both images and words. Christian creators often say that they get these images in their heads and they think, oh, what if
Yeah.
this happened with that image, in this world, and also there was a castle and a dragon, and then off we go into another fantasy adventure.
Right.
I think that more so a certain type of science fiction creator like yourself will ask not just about these images and these technologies, but also the ideas. There are some abstract worldview notions tied up in there along with the images. And to me, as I look back over the history of science fiction, and you've actually written an article in the very first Lorehaven print issue about the history and different types of science fiction. We will link to that in the show notes, an article called Finding Truth in Science Fiction. This seems to me to be a staple in science fiction going back to the beginning. And I just want to ask our second big question here. How do your stories also compare and honor the legacy of those edgier themes explored in other sci-fi? There's plenty, of course, tied up in that label science fiction. You may think of, for example, Star Wars, which is more like a space fantasy or space opera, versus a franchise like Star Trek, which deals a little bit more with traditional science fiction ideas, cloning, the ethics of planetary exploration, the Prime Directive, lots of ethical questions. Obviously, our Earth in the future figures prominently into that universe. And Earth as well is somewhere out there in the Amish vampires universe, and it's certainly the prime setting for the Dark Trench saga, at least starting out.
Those kind of thing, exploration's been part of science fiction from the beginning. Ray Bradbury, back in the 50s, was writing Fahrenheit 451, a book that I think today is relevant, if not more so than it was back then. It talks about certain minority voices taking over the narrative for the whole world, or at least the country that the main character lived in, and just the infusion of entertainment and how that distracts the populace from other things they should be thinking about and worrying about and being concerned about, like family and friends and maintaining of the knowledge. I think this is something that's been part of science fiction. I think it's important, and I think it's certainly something Christians should be a part of because we have a lot to say, a lot of hope to bring too.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, science fiction is the genre for all of us because science and technology affect everyone. And so,
Right.
these are stories that Christians must be a part of, like that we need to be not only discussing stories, but telling our own stories, reading stories, because, so many of these, so many of the ethical debates about science and technology are accelerating really fast. Silicon Valley kind of has this motto of move fast and break things, and so they're pushing the limits before of what we can do before wondering if we should do that.
Yes.
So, Kerry, I want to know about some other sci-fi that has inspired you. Have you been a fan of shows like The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, X-Files, Black Mirror, and anything from those shows come to mind?
Yeah, definitely. Twilight Zone. I watched that as a kid. There, different versions of it, and the thing is, many of the writers there too were writers like Ray Bradbury and other luminaries that just write intriguing stories that ask questions, big questions. I'm kind of a fan of the whole genre ever since sort of the beginning, since I was a little young one. So you name something, I've probably heard about it and probably have read it.
It seems to me as I look over the landscape of science fiction right now, especially if you narrow it to Christian creators, I don't see a lot of science fiction among Christians for sure that is exploring these big issues Zach was talking about earlier. The fact that our lives are increasingly ruled by algorithms, even worldview challenges like free speech and how Christians should engage with politics and all of those big questions. Those seem to be increasingly handled by exclusively nonfiction conversations on the websites, on the podcasts, in books and articles. We
Yes.
seem to limit ourselves to only nonfiction ways of hashing those out, and we have a dearth of stories to hash these out. And I see great opportunity there. But you can't just say, "Oh, somebody needs to go on and make that story." If there's no demand for it, then why bother? Unless you're going to just keep the story to yourself. Of course, we focus on fans at Fantastical Truth, but it is something that I've noticed that our science fiction among Christian creators tends to be more fantasy based, I would say, which moves us into our third big question, which is I don't know, I'm kind of ready to answer this question, but I'm curious how either of you all would answer it. Do most Christian fantasy fans prefer, well, fantasy over edgier sci-fi? That is sci-fi that deals in these questions of ideas and worldviews, along with the fun stuff like technology and space exploration. And I guess I would say that my answer to that question depends on, of course, how you understand sci-fi. Are we talking about softer sci-fi, which is a little bit more about the human characters and a little bit more fantastical, basically fantasy with spaceships? Or are we talking about harder sci-fi, which maybe doesn't deal into or delve into the specifics of orbital mechanics, or go into a very distracting reveal of how the space propulsion works, but at least feels harder, wants to feel more grounded.
Right.
Just as I look around, like I see, I mean, even in the world, it seems that the science fiction tends to be less interested in the big ideas, at least the popular science fiction. But among Christians, when we do get into science fiction by Christian creators, it seems that most of it tends to go softer. That's my answer, but I'm curious about either of yours.
I think that's probably right. I don't see a lot of kind of harder sci-fi writers out there. I don't know if it's because it takes a little more kind of immersion in the science itself, and some people that's easy for, and some people it isn't. It's just not their calling, and so that could be part of it. There's escapism, but sometimes with hard science fiction, it's not as much. It's like The Martian. That's escapism because he's on Mars and we can't do that. But he's also trying to solve problems in a very scientific way. Trying to deal with those with the same kind of technologies and solutions we might try to use here for things. So that might be part of it. It's just takes a little more head scratching. Yeah, I don't know, because in reality, like you said, science fiction is very pervasive. The Hunger Games is science fiction. There are science fiction elements in superhero movies all the time. So I guess it really does depend on how you define it.
Yeah, it seems to me that the science fiction genre functions a lot more often as a seasoning, like you mentioned, the superhero movies. Is Zack
Right.
Snyder's Justice League that we talked about before? Is that science fiction? Well, yes, absolutely. You've got space aliens, and basically Batman has a spaceship,
Right.
or at least an Earth ship. There's some sci-fi tech all over the place. Kal-El comes from Krypton, another planet, and yet you also have Lois Lane living in a very normal apartment, and Martha Kent lives on a farm, and it's sci-fi mixing with the absolutely contemporary. Same thing with horror. A lot of stories tend to use horror as a seasoning, rather than maybe as an exclusive genre. And among Christian fans, most of our stories tend to borrow some of these elements. But Kerry, I would say that at least among people I've asked, hey, who are some Christian authors of science fiction, creators of these types of stories? Most people will name check you. And I know you're not the only game in town, but it should be a bit of an encouragement that at least in their perception, you're on the harder end of the science fiction. You've got the technology there, and it seems that you've got quite a rep.
It's nice to hear. It's definitely an honor. Yeah, and that just makes that we need more folks like me out there. More folks willing to look into science, because there are just so many intriguing ideas out there, and I can't cover them all. So much story fodder. Yeah, that's cool. That's nice to hear, I guess.
Well, it's true, and that's how we get to be friends, and that's how we're here now. And I think that this is still a territory that is open for expansion. And yet one simply can't do what I see, at least in the early days of Christian fantasy advocacy, people milling about on the internet saying, why aren't there more Christian authors? Why aren't there more publishers publishing this? Christian publishers, the traditional ones, have to publish what works. Otherwise, they would be guilty of poor investment. If they know that they can't publish a thick Christian-made science fiction book and be able to get some kind of benefit from that, even financially, and if even on the spiritual level, they know this is not going to serve our readers, this is not where our readers are, then they're going to avoid that kind of story. And it's going to be up to a Christian creator like yourself to go out and publish that story on their own, which you are now doing. So my question then here becomes, what can we possibly do as Christian fans who want to see more of these kinds of stories? Are there possibilities that we have of encouraging our fellow believers to give these kinds of stories a try whenever we find them, as a means of engaging with these issues, of engaging with our real world? And then if demand can slowly begin to grow, sort of like the terraforming approach that we've mentioned in an earlier Fantastical Truth episode, if there's a more organic desire for these kinds of stories, then that would bring more of them, but how could we possibly do that? Starting with an episode and a discussion like this one.
So it's a good question. I mean, obviously the simple things can be a big help. Just, the word of mouth sells books, and always has and always will. And today we have a much bigger megaphone for word of mouth, right? Because you can share with your friends on Facebook and on your blogs and your podcasts and whatever. So obviously, that's a simple thing, really, and it helps a lot. And obviously, leaving reviews for books on Amazon and Goodreads and wherever else you might buy books helps a lot too. Or, having book clubs where you read your favorite Christian author and share about it. These all help, and you just never know where they might go. Those kind of movements.
Well, something I've shared about before is you have to kind of be willing to go off the beaten path a little bit. And I grew up in Austin, where it's all about the the indie music and the kind of obscure bands that people like to be the first one to learn about and share with others. And that's carried over a little bit to my adulthood. And so in the early 2000s, when Left Behind was really big, I was reading those books, but I also discovered this other series called the Christ Clone Trilogy.
Oh yeah.
Very, very similar eschatology to Left Behind, but it took a much, I guess, a darker approach in some ways, in that the way, it's a spoiler alert, but not really, but the way that the Antichrist comes about is researchers find some living cells on the Shroud of Turin and decide to clone those cells in basically using a surrogate mother, and then that child grows up to be the Antichrist. And so that was just a really fascinating way of thinking how the end times could come about, sort of through this mad science. And then the rest of the series, it has the judgments of Revelation happen, but in very very brutal ways at times. And so it was, man, it was scary at times. Like there was definitely some horror seasoning in that series, not very well known compared to Left Behind. And so I've really enjoyed getting to tell people about that series. It's just like, here's a really different approach to this, although it's still basically the same story.
Hmm.
So I think we have to just kind of be willing just to try out new things that maybe we're the first person to try that book and talk about it.
Well, Zach, you've also mentioned in a few Fantastical Truth episodes the existence of, I think it was a duology, or was it a trilogy? The very fact that I can't remember kind of supports my point. It was the Lamb Among the Stars series. I think it was published by Tyndale House. Yeah, it was a trilogy. That's right. It was published by Tyndale House a few years ago. Unfortunately, it is not very well known, and that may be because it was, I think, straight up Christian-made sci-fi with edgier themes. For one thing, the end times belief was going to be wholly contradictory to the perception of many Christians. This is a post-millennial series, which I think, even as a non-post-millennialist, I think it's fantastic to ask that what-if question, because it is set in a world, hundreds, thousands of years from now. Humanity has conquered the stars before Christ returns, and you have effectively a kind of utopia. The glory of the Lord has filled the universe. Earth is out there somewhere, presumably the capital of this very Christian empire. And then, of course, that wouldn't be very dramatic if you didn't have the reemergence of evil into this world. I find that approach fascinating. And yet, just the very fact that it is so obscure, by author Chris Wally.
Yes,
I think he was back on Speculative Faith back in the day. I wonder where he's at right now. But it is a fascinating concept that I think did not meet a lot of readers where they were at the time. But I would hope that as we're continuing to terraform more people that we know, the word of mouth that you're talking about, Kerry, I would hope that that series could find an audience, because there's so many fascinating issues to explore in there. And from my memory of what I read of it, not a lot of answered questions. I mean, that's the point of these stories, to be part of the conversation, not to try to wrap everything up, with a tidy bow at the end,
right?
But to further the conversation. And how much more do we need those kinds of stories now, when Christians more than ever are engaging in these controversial issues, politically and otherwise, wholly in nonfiction ways, and sometimes some unhealthy ways? I think we need these kinds of stories to give voice to these issues in fictional worlds, whether or not you call the Amish, or Islam, Islam in the future. Give it other names if you want to, but even a more specific parallel, asking what if about that in these futuristic worlds, that I think is a very healthy and functional way to ask these questions and discuss amongst ourselves, and then maybe eventually, for the glory of God, come up with some solutions. Like right now, if we had, I'm on a roll here, but right now, if we had a more organic demand for these kinds of stories, and then Christian publishers and indie authors who were able and willing to meet that demand, I think we could see some really great art coming out right now with all these different themes as part of the story recipe. Stories that would ask questions about, okay, what happens if we do go dystopian? What if this or that group ends up taking over? What would it be like for Christians or their opponents in that kind of society? What about rights? What about Christians in politics? And where are some of the ways that we need to compromise, and where are some of the ways that we don't need to compromise? All of those would be fascinating concepts, and I wish that we would see more of those asked for by the church. As it is right now, our subculture is obsessed with beating each other up about the political issues directly. Maybe these stories could also provide a bit of a steam valve for us to release some of this frustration as well. Thinking out loud here, but that's my alternate universe of the reality that we actually see. Asking what if.
It's good. I like it. I like the what ifs.
Well, Stephen, I have a theory about that. So I wonder if the reason Lamb Among the Stars is not as well known is specifically because of the eschatology, that it's a post-millennial point of view, which again, I'm not post-millennial either, but I love that series. I love it despite the post-millennial view, and it's a fun exploration of that as well. But I have a theory that as Christians, we tend to be well, whatever you want to call it, more discerning or more snobby about the theology of a Christian book than the theology of a secular book.
Oh, we absolutely are more snobby that way.
Yeah.
Yes.
And sometimes it's a benefit, but if anything, shouldn't it be the reverse? Shouldn't we be a little bit more suspicious and have our shields up, as it were, when we go in to watch a Star Trek episode, which is made by and largely for secular humanists or moral agnostics? Shouldn't we be a little bit more trusting about a Christian-made story? I mean, if anything, Tyndale House guys, like those are the Left Behind guys. They've published Randy Alcorn books. They're trusted. And yet they published this series, and then, I don't know, it just for some reason didn't find an audience. And maybe that's an issue of marketing, and we're not going to get on marketing right now. But the covers were fabulous. The titles were awesome. And yet it's the one example I can think of that was like a hardcover, serious effort at Christian-made sci-fi, and yet it didn't seem to find an audience. The only other examples I can think of traditionally published Christian books were like some paperbacks in the 90s and maybe early 2000s. I can think of a few I read that seemed kind of promising. Zach, they were even going to deal with aliens. Aliens, spoiler alert, guess who the aliens were. Go on, guess. What was the surprise, stunning plot twist about who the aliens and UFOs and strange signs actually were?
Demons.
They're all demons, you guys. Watch out. I do think we should watch out for demons. But that doesn't mean that every story involving aliens has to inform the gentle reader that the aliens are actually demons. Watch out, be on your guard, and then it's another issue of what seemed like a harder sci-fi premise, kind of taking a more softer direction. Now we're in the territory of not the physical and the technological, but the spiritual, because an alien you can shoot with a ray gun, and the ray gun would have certain physical properties, and you might imagine how it works and all of that and get all up into the science. But if it's just a demon, then obviously from scripture, you're not going to shoot it with the ray gun.
Right.
These only come out through the word and through prayer, unless you get some kind of weird other demon teaching from somewhere. The only way to deal with a spiritual foe is spiritual, but in science fiction, the spiritual and the physical are commingled. And I think that's a little bit closer to the real world that we live in and need to engage.
Well, I love the alien topic. I could talk all day on that. And
Yes.
I think it is definitely a topic that there needs to be more Christian writing about, more Christian fiction about, because my goodness, what a hot topic that is right now. It's all over the mainstream news because of this Pentagon report that's coming out in June.
Oh, yes.
And, what are we doing as Christian? And I'm not saying this in an accusatory way, but like, what are we as Christians doing to prepare for that? What are the conversations that we are having about, possible alien visitors or just even life on other planets? How are we processing that through our understanding of Scripture? Are we going to get caught flat-footed, in the similar way that when Galileo discovered other planets and moons orbiting other planets? Are we going to have sort of a crisis of faith with a lot of people that just like, well, I don't know if I can, I don't know how to make sense of this, so I guess I'll just kind of put all this to the side for right now. I think that there are lots of ways that Christians can make sense of this, whatever all this ends up being. How can we address these other than just kind of plugging our ears and not wanting to talk about it? How can we address these through stories? How can we make sense of just the fact that we live in a huge universe with tons and tons of planets that we're finding all the time? I think these are great topics for Christians to explore. And again, I don't think we have to find all the answers ahead of everyone else, but I think that we have to be comfortable talking with people. And these are fun topics. They're topics that our neighbors love to talk about. So let's just talk about it.
Yeah, and even amongst ourselves, we're already talking about them. We just don't see, well, maybe not so much the aliens, but the political topics, the issues of Christians in the world and what we do in a culture that's increasingly turning against us. We are talking about those things, and we have trusted, wise biblical voices talking about those things, but all in nonfiction ways. The fact that we aren't naturally already seeing an opening or a need for Christian-made stories to be participating in these conversations, that speaks to a hole in our worldview. That speaks to the fact that we are a little bit too bent in the direction of didacticism, if that's the word, about these topics, and yet we also need to imagine our way through these topics. And this has evangelistic applications, but we're not just about evangelism here. If I were speaking only about Christians by and exclusively for Christians, I am okay with that. A lot of people aren't, because they think that every story needs to mainly, evangelize your unsaved neighbor. I think that is a secondary application, but I'm primarily concerned with how Christians grow in the vertical direction. How are we becoming more like Jesus? How are we thinking like him, even as we act in the world and share his gospel with others? That to me seems to be the primary goal, and we can't get to the secondary goal of evangelism and those conversations without first pursuing that primary goal. So we're going to continue to do that on Fantastical Truth as we're dealing with fantasy, science fiction, and beyond, whatever flavor of science fiction you have. And it's been fantastic to have Kerry with us, talking about all of his stories so far. Not just the Perils in Plain Space series, but also the Dark Trench saga, that initial trilogy, and then the Dark Trench Shadow, which is set in the same world. We actually have the latest. This is the latest one, right, Kerry? Book 2, Fraught. It's got robots.
Yes.
It's got robots punching each other.
Yes, they are. Yes, there's a little battle going on.
Yeah, which you're going to see as the thumbnail image for this podcast. So, Kerry, we've got to know, of course, where can listeners find all of your stories, more about you, check out those different series, and then hopefully, hint, find out what is in your creative future?
Sure. My website is www.nietz.com. That's NIETZ.com. You can find all my books and all the news and kind of where you can buy the books. And I'm on Facebook and MeWe and some of the other sites, but yeah, the website's probably the best place to go. Yeah, it's been great being here.
Well, we'll hope to have you back. Maybe eventually, once people develop the implants, we'll have to have you back to explain how those work and some of the moral difficulties of that.
Yes.
And if anyone is putting together vampires or vampirism in a spaceship, you're definitely the recognized authority on that, as well as the werewolf syndrome.
Yes. Yeah, your past discussion there too reminded me that in Dark Trench there actually are some aliens in there. At least I think they're aliens,
Yeah, it's a little uncertain in book 2. Yeah.
And 2 and in 3 a bit too, and I thought, that was kind of a unique way of looking at aliens and not being necessarily definite about, okay, what are these and what are their motives? What are they up to? But
no, you couldn't just throw up your hands afterwards and go, demons again.
You could, you could, or maybe not. That was the neat thing about the worldview that Dark Trench is a part of, is it actually allowed for a few more entities, to enter the mix. So yeah, I thought that was kind of a fascinating way to go with it, and hopefully readers check it out.
Kerry, did you also want to say what might be in your creative future, or is that a to be announced?
Well, I also work on some flat out science fiction for a gaming company called Takamo, and all the books so far have been, the main characters have been man-sized rats. They're fun, ornery creatures, and it's kind of a mix of Firefly and giant alien rats, and a little bit of Star Wars in there too. And my next story is a bit of an alternate timeline that they're involved in. So it's kind of an alternate history with giant man-sized rats involved. So I can't wait for people to see that. It should be out this year at some point. And then the thing I'm working on now is sort of a straight out robotic science fiction. So we'll see what happens there.
Every listener is thinking this, so I'll go ahead and say it and make us all happy and prove that I'm telepathic. Rodents of unusual size? I don't think they exist. Yeah. There we go. Well, Kerry, Godspeed on all your endeavors. We're definitely going to have you back, and very much look forward to finding out what's ahead in your future, and collaborating with you about these issues and exploring with you those what if questions in your various sci-fi universes.
Great. Thanks. Great to be here again. Thanks.
Well, our thanks to Kerry Nietz for joining us today. And now let's open the mailbag and hear from the fantastic fans. We've got a note here from Amy K, who wrote to us after listening to episode 60. Why don't real researchers heed sci-fi warnings against mad science? And Amy writes, quote, I really enjoyed this podcast. So needed today. Plus, entertaining, insightful, and full of wonderful references. The only ones you missed mentioning or didn't wish to that I could think of was the movie Cherry 2000 and an episode of Star Trek Voyager. Cherry 2000 is a movie about a sex bot sci-fi adventure where the main character tries to reclaim his favorite sex bot after it's recalled and finds he's actually in love with the pilot who helps them, played by Melanie Griffith. Plus, the episode of Star Trek Voyager where a young Vulcan struggles with his Ponfar and tries to mate with B'Elanna. When she rejects him, the doctor, the holographic doctor, tries to create for him a mate in the holodeck. He fools the doctor into thinking it worked, then goes down to the planet to find B'Elanna to complete the Ponfar. A very strange and interesting episode. All of that to say, it was a wonderful episode. I look forward to listening to more interesting topics and breakdowns. Fiction is the mirror, helping to reflect our nature and learn from it, end quote. Thank you so much, Amy, for that note. And those are some great references. I am familiar with that Star Trek Voyager episode. I haven't seen that movie, though, so that sounds very interesting as well.
Next on Fantastical Truth, we have incidentally set up this theme over the last couple of episodes. Should Christians act like zombies to support their favorite stories? Support brains. And what we mean by that is that, at least in the past, whenever a Christian movie maker or publisher puts out a very important story, Christians will get into the mood of, we need to support this story to send a message to someone, your unsaved neighbor, to other Christians, to that bad pastor in your past, or maybe big Hollywood. Is this the point of fiction? And, spoiler alert, because it is not the point of fiction, how can Christian fans gently, graciously engage with this idea and maybe point ourselves and our friends in the direction of a healthier, more biblical view of what stories are meant to do? Meanwhile, as you are enjoying science fiction, whether it's hard or soft or thematically edgy or other kinds of edgy, always do this for the glory of God. Science fiction does help to reflect human nature in all of its evils and all of its goodnesses. Any of those requires careful discernment, and let's try to make sure that we are building demand for better stories that engage with real-world issues, yet also in a creative way that will glorify our author, Jesus Christ, as we continue to seek and find his fantastical truth.